Hello everyone, today I will be explaining how to take the audio unit plugin Superior Drummer 3 and mapping it into an Ableton drum rack. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank Jester Mgee for his video explaining how to do this with the Native Instruments battery plugin. The general concepts I'll be discussing here are the same as his, and I'll definitely be linking to his video in the description as a reference. He really did a fantastic job, and I wouldn't have been able to do this video without his. But there are some slight differences between battery and Superior Drummer in how the multi-channel routing works. And there's also just a lot more samples in Superior Drummer, so I go into that a little bit as well. So I just thought it'd be helpful if I shared what I learned after following his video and tweaking it to work with Superior Drummer. So let's go ahead and jump in. So on the screen here, you can see that we start with an empty live set. I've just enabled one MIDI track here. And this is really where we're going to start. And so the first thing you want to do is open up your Superior Drummer plugin. So I like to search. I just think that's one of the nice things about Ableton is that you can search. So here we go. Just going to drag this in here onto this MIDI track. All right, so this is loaded up. Now you will notice that this loaded up to a very specific kit. With some very specific output settings. The reason why I did that is because this is the kit that I use most often, and this is the one that I actually mapped to my drum rack. But for today, we're going to start from 0. So I'm just going to choose a different kit. This one was one of the first expansions that I bought when I first had Easy Drummer. And one thing that's good for this video is that it's nice and small. It doesn't have a whole lot of elements, so we'll be able to get through it pretty quickly. So now that we have our plugin on our MIDI track, you can definitely play it. So I'm just hitting my MIDI controller here. And that's great. And if that's how you want to roll, that's great. That's how I rolled for a long time until I found Jester's video and totally changed my workflow. So the next thing you want to do is come over to the actual plugin right here down at the bottom. You're going to right click. Before I go any further, I should mention that I'm doing this on a Mac. So if I say Command, if you're on a PC, you'll use Control. And if I say Option, you'll use Alt. Other than that, this really should be pretty seamless between the two operating systems. All right, so we come over here, we right click, and we're going to go Group to Drum Rack. Now this function within itself is actually pretty awesome, but we're not going to stop there. The next thing we want to do is we're going to open up our chain selector and also our in-out. The next thing you want to come over here, we don't want to just have this on one pad. We want this to spread out across all the pads. So we're going to click this here and we're going to go to all notes. And what that does is as you hit the pads, it has actually already started mapping. And again, this could be a stopping point. If you just want it to spread across the pads, then this is a great place to stop. However, I think if you continue along the process, you're going to see the benefits of being able to see information and color the pads if you're using a push device or a launch pad. And so let's keep on moving here. So we've set the receive to all. We've got drums on all of our pads. Next thing you want to do is over on the chain list here, we're going to start by adding a new chain. So you right click, create chain, easy peasy. And this first chain we're actually going to use for the kick. So I'm going to click on it, Command R, kick. And let's find our kick. Now, they have gone through and put some general MIDI suggestions on here. And these can be a good starting point, but especially depending on the kit that you're using within Superior Drummer and how it's laid out and mapped, these may or may not be correct. So C1 is going to be our kick here. And another great thing about this plugin, if you go over to the drums tab, obviously if you hear it, that sounds like a kick, but you've also got that visual feedback here of the kick being played. All right, so we know that that's our kick. So we are going to continue this process across these 16 pads here. Now, if you want to go all in, just keep on scrolling up and hitting pads and seeing if you find things. I know when I set up my post-rock kit, there are, I think, 64 different pads. And the reason why I did that is I like to use the inbuilt MIDI grooves that come bundled inside this plugin. And I wanted to make sure I was accounting for all of those hits when I set this up into the rack. However, that's totally up to you, depending on your preference, depending on the kit you're using. All right, so again, we're going to grab this, we're going to hold down Option, drag it over to the next pad. Now, obviously, we're copying it, so it's going to keep the same text. But that, that sounds to me like a side stick. You might call it a rim shot. I'm going to call it a side stick. So we're going to Command R into here. Rename that. And let's Option drag over to D1. See what we got here. Nice snare. All right, so we're going to rename that. Heading on over to D#1, that's another snare, so let's Option drag that. That's an example of multiple hits on the same element within the plugin. Kind of an alternate snare sound. There's our floor tom. I'm just going to call that FT. And again, I'm just holding down the Option button and dragging. There's our first hi-hat sample. I'm going to call that closed. Another floor tom, so we'll just copy that straight over. So we got another closed hi-hat here with a slightly different hit. That's going to be tom 2. Open hat. Tom 2 again. There we go, Tom 1. Got crash 1. Crash 1 again, a little slightly different hit. And our ride. And I'll just mention it here again as I'm renaming this last one. If you were to scroll up, you can see you've got all these different banks for the drum rack. Scroll up and down. Like I said, when I set up my post-rock pack, it used pretty much every pad on the drum rack up and down. And if I were doing this for real, I would probably take the extra 20 minutes or so and go through every sample and map it and name it. And ultimately that is what you want to do. But I'm trying to just get the concepts across here of how you go ahead and do this process. So you can see now over in this chain list, we've got quite a few samples, and each of these samples actually is its own separate chain. It's mapped to its own separate little pad here on the drum rack. So now let's go ahead and make some groups. Now, we're not going to group the kick because there's only one kick sample. However, if there were multiple kicks, we would group the kicks as well. I just happen to know from working on the other one that Superior Drummer pretty much just has one trigger for the kick. So let's group these snares together. So what you're going to do is you're going to find all the snares. Now these happen to be in a nice little row here. So we're going to highlight them all using the shift and the mouse, and then we're going to hit Command G on the keyboard, and look at that. It just created a drum rack within a drum rack. This is like the Inception drums. So over here, you can see we've got all of these samples here. Before we go any further, I'm just going to click on these, hit Command A to select all of them, right click, and you want to make sure that this color automatically is selected, because then we can come over here and we're going to rename this to snares, because it's going to be our snares group, and I'm going to color these green. Again, you can really do any color you want, but you can see that these followed suit over here. And if you were using a push device, looking down at the pads now that are selected, they have turned green. So that's fun. All right, now let's put our toms together. And again, if you need to select things that aren't next to each other, you use the command button while you're using the mouse. And again, Command G. And these have collapsed into a group. Again, we're going to rename this with Command R. We're going to call it toms. And let's choose a nice dark blue. All right. Put our hats together. All of our hats. Command G. Command R. Hats. And today I feel like making these orange. Finally, our cymbals. Command G. Command R. And depending on how your naming conventions typically work, you could call these cymbals. You could also call these overheads. I'm just calling them cymbals for today. And just to keep with the colors, let's go yellow. All right, so we have our master, which contains the actual plugin, which is showing up over here. And then we have our groups. All right, now up to this point, if you go back to the mixer on your VST plugin here, or sorry, audio unit plugin, you'll see I've kept all the outputs on master, out 1 and 2. And the reason that I did that is because if you are auditioning samples and you've already enabled multi-channel outputs here, you have to make sure that you've assigned those outputs to tracks in Ableton. And it's just a whole lot of extra work that really doesn't need to be a part of the process at that point. You're just auditioning samples, you're getting them onto the pads. So it's just easier to keep it on 1 and 2. But now we're at the point where we want to move this to the next step. So we're going to be on the mixer tab. We're going to go to this mixer button with the drop down arrow, click the drop down, apply multi-channel outputs. And what that has done is it has taken output groups across the mixer here. Now, for our purposes, I would like the kick to appear on a separate track from the master plugin track. So because Superior Drummer sees 1 and 2 as the master output, that's also what Ableton sees. And you'll see why that's important in just a minute. But for now, I'm going to click here. I'm going to assign it to 31 and 32 because those are not being used. Well, they are now, but that's from the kick. All right. So now that we've done that, we've got our groups here. So you'll just want to keep this window open if you can to refer to those. How do we get the audio into its own tracks? You know, because you come along here, you can see now that I've enabled, if I would go back to stereo, you can see, you can hear everything, but it's all coming through this first channel here, which is where the plugin sits. So let's put the multi-channel outputs back. Let's put this one back on 31, 32, and let's get to work. So the way that we're going to accomplish this is by selecting one chain at a time, and we're going to use the Ableton external instrument. So if you're in your library over here, you're going to click on the instruments, you're going to click on external instrument. If you've done some of these already, you'll see a drop down. You can see I built the drum rack for my other Superior Drummer kit, so that's why that's showing up here. But if you've never done one, this drop down won't reveal anything. Essentially, you're just going to grab the header anyway. So go ahead and grab this, drag it down, and you're going to drag it right onto the chain. And it appears right here in the chain now. Now this MIDI, it's actually already taken care of. You don't need to worry about it, but you do need to select it. So we're going to say that the MIDI is coming from the drum rack and on channel 1. If you're using some kind of external kit to trigger your Superior Drummer, hopefully you have enough MIDI knowledge to know how that's working and where the channels are assigned and how to assign those here. But for our purposes, everything's just coming through on channel 1, so we really don't need to worry about it. And you can see Ableton actually doesn't even give you the option for outs 1 and 2. It starts with 3 and 4. Now 3 and 4 is our snares, so that's why I put the kick on 31 and 32. It was an empty channel. So we're going to select that. And now, when we hit our kick, it's coming through on the drum rack, but it's also coming through on this kick channel, which is what we want. So we're going to continue this process. Let's go to snares, and we're going to drag the external instrument right onto where it says drop devices here. And I like to move it up to the top. It's really just for organization purposes. It's really just a preference thing. Now, the snares in Superior Drummer, this is another thing you just want to bear in mind. They mic the snare top and they mic the snare bottom, and they're doing that separately. And I think that's really great. It adds an element of realism, and we want to maintain that. So we're actually going to duplicate our external instrument in here. And just for organization's sake, I'm going to name this snare top, and the next one I'm going to name snare bottom. Really, really obvious naming. Okay, so again, we need to select our MIDI, and it automatically goes to channel 1. Now, the first one, like we said, snare top, that is going to be 3 and 4. Now, for some reason, I'm on snare bottom here, so let's just get this set to 5 and 6. And then we'll go back to this other chain and set it up, drum rack, 3 and 4. All right, so now when we hit our snares, they're all coming through on this nice section here. And if you wanted to, do a little bit of additional mixing here, you can mix the chains here, although I think it's a little more hands-on to just mix it on the plugin. All right. So let's keep moving here. We're going to do the toms, external instrument, drop devices here. This one's just going to be 1, so we don't need to rename it. So we'll just assign it. And you can see the toms are all going through 9 and 10. So let's pick 9 and 10. Okay. Hi-hats, same deal. External instrument, drop devices, move it to the top. Select our MIDI, and then you can see hi-hats are on 7 and 8. If you're really paying attention at home, you'll see that I went out of order, but it's all going to the right places, so it doesn't really matter. And finally, our cymbals. Drag our external instrument in, organize it, get it assigned to the MIDI. And our overheads, so cymbals, overheads, it's naming semantics, but they're on 11 and 12, so let's pick 11 and 12. All right, now at this point, you may be thinking, hey, there's more channels in here that are being used. You've got the ambient channel, you've got the compressor room channel. Yeah, I know, we don't have a place for those, but we're gonna make one. So even though they're not triggered by a pad in the drum rack, you can still add the chain into the device. So let's create a chain. Let's call it, something real original, like AMB. Let's set it to all. And let's drop an external instrument on it. Again, everything's coming through channel 1, so it doesn't really matter. But this time, we're going to pick 13 and 14 to match up with the outputs. And then, because we're doing the exact same thing for the compressor room channel, let's just duplicate Command D, Command R to rename, comp room. And this is nice because it pulls all the settings over. All we have to do is change the outputs. So we're going to change it to 1516. All right, so now you can see we got all sorts of faders moving here. And what's great about this is you retain the full use of the plugin. You're not losing anything at all. So if you come over here and you say, hey, I really want to put this groove on here and I want to play it. Look at that, it's coming through all the faders just as it should be, but you're still retaining all the use of the plugin in here. So that's great. Now at this point, best thing you can do is hit that save button. We just did a lot of work and it would be a shame for it to go to waste. So I'm gonna name this Nashville because that's the plugin pack that it came with. So go ahead and hit that save button. Over here in the library, you'll see a new entry. And I'll do SD3 since it's coming from Superior Drummer. Nashville drum rack. Okay. All right, so what's really great about this is if you have a brand new project and you say, oh man, I really want those Nashville drums on there. You come over to your user library, drum racks. You've got this MIDI track here. You just drag this right in here. And depending on your system, you let it load up. And it has saved our output settings. It has loaded up the same kit. And it's loaded up our drum rack with all of our outputs and routing. If you open the little window here, you can see everything has saved across. Voila. And so that's all for today's video. I hope it was helpful for you. If it was, please consider hitting subscribe, hitting the thumbs up. And again, go check out Jester Mgee's channel. He was the video maker that inspired this. And without his content, I wouldn't have been able to modify this for the Superior Drummer plugin. So that's it for today. Thanks everyone. See ya.